So as you probably already know, we're in a second wave of the coronavirus. And we have been doing remote recording. So some episodes are going to have a lower quality audio. Those are the ones that were recorded in this second wave of corona. And some of them are going to be when we were visiting in person. So there's going to be a mix between in-person and distanced recordings. So yeah. Get off our ass about it. It's a worldwide pandemic. What do you want?
Warning, this podcast contains violence, sexuality, gore, and other horrible and disturbing things. Listener discretion is advised. Also, the hosts of this venture are ignorant dipshits, so please do not take anything they say as fact. And enjoy the show.
Now, are you sitting comfortably? Good. Then we'll begin.
Today we had 15 homicides and 63 violent crimes, as if that's the way it's supposed to be.
It is our basic human right to be forgot.
A second plane now has crashed into the other tower of the World Trade Center.
Put chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
The defendant shall be incarcerated for the rest of her natural life with no possibility of parole.
You are not machines. You are not cattle. You are men.
We were somewhere around Barstow, on the edge of the desert, when the drugs began to take hold.
Occultae Veritatis.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and people beyond the binary. I'm Oud Gallifrey, and we are distance recording once again because we are surviving a massive second wave of COVID in Canada. My co-hosts,
Murray,
Richard Bigley,
and always haunting us through our electronics, the soundboard demon.
Yeah, this time they put me on a flash drive and shoved me in a computer, and I can literally know everything. It's terrifying. Why is there so much porn? It's all porn.
Worry about it.
Now, when I was a baby child, my mama told me that Jesus Christ was real and performed miracles, and he lived in my heart. So we need to figure out whether this fucker existed and to what level. So we're going to be looking into Jesus Christ today. Before that, we're going to need a little bit of poison.
Did you charge Jesus rent while he lived in your heart?
No, he was a freeloader.
God damn it, Jesus.
God damn Jesus.
So, what's your poison?
So what are you guys smoking, drinking, all that kind of stuff?
Well, I am drinking some Bush beer. It's my fridge beer. It's fine.
I just finished a can of Diet Coke.
I didn't bring my water bottle to work, so I came home super dehydrated. So I'm just drinking like my big water bottle full of water, and I'm hoping to hell it turns into wine halfway through, but I don't think it's likely.
We can always dream.
Could mix some juice in there, and then, after a couple of weeks, try it.
I think so.
Gross.
Yeah, just have to peel the layer of moss off the top, and then just chug the alcohol. Yeah, it's a bit harder to as the people who've been listening to us for even a little bit would be able to tell, like during our distance recordings, it's hard to do a review of one product because we're all in different locations. So we just drink and smoke what's in front of us. So during our long distance episodes, you get to the main content quicker. So think of it as that.
That's right.
We'll go back to drinking and reviewing weird shit when we're able to sit in a room together. Alrighty, do you guys want to dive into Jesus?
Yeah, let's dive into Jesus. There's nothing more than I want is to just dive face first into all of that sweet, sweet godly love.
I want to feel his sweet salvation all over my face.
Funny thing, there's actually a spot in hell where the people that love Jesus just a little too much, they get to dive into Jesus, but then he turns into a whole bunch of pointy teeth. It's great.
I don't know. I think he was just a person. I don't know.
Just a normal person like us. He was a selfless person.
I have no clue. He was a man.
I think he was a marketing genius because he got people to believe him.
I don't think he's the son of God. I don't believe that at all.
If David Copperfield was in the day of Jesus, he would be Jesus.
I'm pretty sure he existed. Like, I'm not gonna say that he didn't exist.
He was God's son, but so was Gandhi, and so was Muhammad, and so was, we're all God's children.
Jesus is someone I pray to.
Well, Jesus is my Lord and Savior, and he, to me, is the symbol of just ultimate forgiveness and ultimate love. He's sort of that constant figure in my life.
Jesus is also Isa in Arabic, and he was a messenger as well.
He was just extremely enlightened, religiously and morally.
Was somebody that just tried to impart wisdom on others and make the world a better place.
I think he saw something that a lot of people didn't see and still don't see in others. And I think that's just a lot of love and hope.
Jesus sort of seemed like an ominous figure. He was God, and it was hard to relate to him. But I think as I've grown in my faith a lot, I've really started to see Jesus as my closest friend.
Alrighty, so I'm going to try and treat Jesus like a mystery crime case. And I'm going to try and look at the physical evidence, the eyewitnesses, the historical evidence, the archaeological evidence. Just where can we see where this guy could have existed on any level? And just as a disclaimer, I'm not a historian, I'm not an expert. I know fucking nothing about ancient Palestine besides what I read on Wikipedia over the last couple days. So, yeah, don't take my word as the final word on this. There's people that's dedicated their entire careers to trying to answer this question. This is just my go at it.
Well, we're all just a bunch of fuckheads.
You guys heard the disclaimer. Yeah.
Exactly.
So let's look at the so-called physical evidence. And while I'm going over the physical evidence, I'm going to take the opportunity to debunk some evidence that's not really evidence, starting with the Shroud of Turin.
Did this linen cloth cover Jesus' body after his crucifixion? Is it proof of his resurrection? For centuries, these questions have been asked by theologians, historians, scientists, and millions of pilgrims. What is agreed on is that the shroud reflects wounds that are consistent with those endured by Jesus during the crucifixion, as described in the Gospel, and the linen cloth also has blood stains on it.
Through tests on the material, it was determined that the shroud has human blood on it. It was also established that the type of blood is type AB.
Yet still, there's no consensus on its origin or how the image of a bearded man was imprinted on the cloth. Now the shroud is on display in the Basilica of Turin. Kept in a temperature-controlled glass cover for 2 months, the 14-foot-long cloth is expected to be seen by more than 2 million pilgrims. It's one of the most scrutinized objects in Christianity. The last test carried out in 1978 suggested the cloth probably dates back to the 1300s. Not all experts, though, agree.
For many believers, it's a way to engage in a conversation about the passion of Christ and his love. For others, it is a way to reflect on suffering, violence, evil, etc.
The Church has not officially endorsed nor denied the authenticity of the shroud, focusing instead on the spiritual reflection it triggers.
Yeah, so the Shroud of Turin was this ancient artifact, or so-called ancient artifact, and it was purported to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Like, in the Bible, the part where they stripped him down from the cross after he died and they wrapped him in a nice sheet for burial, that's the sheet where it came from. And there's superstition that it's soaked in his blood and sweat, so it's holy in that way. Yeah, it kind of made the circuit around Christian churches for a long time. Yeah, for hundreds of years, this thing traveled around, and from church to church to church, and people even made pilgrimages to visit it. Like, were you guys ever told that the Shroud of Turin was like a real thing or anything like that?
Oh, yeah, I'd heard of it before.
Well, in 1988, it was radiocarbon dated. Now, just as a reminder, Jesus died at around 33 AD, according to the Bible. This Shroud of Turin was aged to be between 1260, to originate from the year 1260 to about 1390. So that's about, at the very least, about 1200 years off of Jesus' death.
You don't say.
Yeah. And there's been some arguments that the radiocarbon dating got it wrong because it was just contaminated by materials from the Middle Ages, but the actual burial cloth came from before. There's also an argument that a type of technique that involved carbon monoxide, or the way that the shroud was stored in an area that had more than normal carbon monoxide, skewed the results. But the people, scientists and universities have retested and refuted all of these excuses. So the Shroud of Turin is just not from Jesus' time.
What if
Right.
God?
It's just some other dude's shroud.
What if God changed the dating on the carbon or whatever, the breakdown of the carbon molecules? God intervenes, changes that to trick us, or not to trick us, but to rather test us and test our faith.
I think that could be
There's some
totally
big
true.
claims.
That is definitely what happened.
Yeah, big
Like
if
dinosaur
true.
bones who were buried by the devil.
Again, testing your faith.
That's right. We all need a little bit of testing sometimes.
I don't know. God, the more that he does this, like this cloak and dagger test my faith shit, the more he seems like a bad magician to me. So I don't know. I don't know if I want to spend eternity with that dude anyway.
It's an illusion, Michael.
Also, purported to be evidence of Jesus, there's nails from the cross and wood from the cross, all over Europe and Africa and America. There's a whole bunch of churches that claim to have a beam from the cross or a chunk of wood from the cross or like nails that were driven into Jesus. And whenever these things were allowed to be tested, they never aged back to Jesus's day. And even if they did, you could never tell if it was a nail that was in Jesus's foot or a piece of wood that was in Jesus's cross or just a piece of wood and a nail that happened to come from the same time period. And also, a lot of these pieces, when they're tested, they date back to a weirdly specific time period. This period of about 30 years in the 11th century. And it's because Christianity was getting into vogue. More and more people were drifting over to it. Sects were opening. It was becoming the hot new thing, and it was propagating and collecting a lot of new worshipers. And of course, when you have a whole bunch of people flocking to a new religion, you have people that are willing to exploit that. So of course, in the 11th century, there was a whole flurry of counterfeiters that were selling all kinds of pieces of the cross and nails and spread it all over the place in the 11th century. And that's where most of these nails and pieces of wood from quote unquote Jesus' cross came from.
Yeah, that makes sense. You're always going to have hucksters.
So Christianity had been propagating through sects, is what you're telling me.
Sects.
I think so. I mean, we did learn about flirty fishing with the children of God early on in the podcast, so sort of.
That's right. Yeah, I remember
they
that.
were Christian, weren't they?
Yeah, ish.
Yeah.
But you can only have
Sexy
sex
Christian.
with somebody in the same sex.
Because if you have sex with members of different sex, and the sex isn't different, the sex isn't the same.
That's right.
Isn't the same. Oh, I forget the line. Yeah, Bo Burnham, by the way. Hot shit. You guys should look it up. Something else came forward known as the Jordan lead codices. Apparently it was found inside of a cave in Jordan in about 2005, and it was a strange book. Instead of the pages being made of parchment or leather, they were made with lead, and they were bound with a metal wire.
Weird.
Oh, yeah. And inside it described one of the earliest accounts of Jesus. The trick is that after extensive investigation, it's been shown that the lead is old enough to be from the period of Jesus or shortly after, approximately 2,000 years old. A piece of leather found near them was also radiocarbon dated to about 2,000 years ago. But the rub is, and this was purported to be like, oh, this mentions Jesus, it's from his time, all that kind of stuff. And what they found when they investigated it further is the inscriptions in the lead, so the things that were carved into the lead, are actually about half as old as the lead itself. So it's not like these inscriptions were put into these lead pages about like 1,000 years after the lead was created.
It's like when you buy a bunch of journals and you just hang on to them and hang on to them and hang on to them. So you have like a 20-year-old journal that you start using 20 years later.
Yeah, exactly. And like like, say you got that journal from 20 years ago, and like there was some big celebrity 20 years ago that you could document their history, but you just like wait 10 years and then you write it down. Like you couldn't you that you were like a direct eyewitness of that person. You could be just anybody writing it down in these books.
That sounds pretty sus.
Yeah. Yeah, and these books, these are some of the things where it starts to get a little like gray area, because like difference between the ages of the inscriptions and the pages and the metal wire, it's still being hotly contested and tested. The method they use to find the age of the carvings into the lead is one that's not agreed upon by all historians. So the age of this book that mentions Jesus is still hotly contested, but the majority opinion is that the carvings in these lead pages that mention Jesus come almost 1,000 years after his death, so no real sign of a direct eyewitness or anything like that.
Right.
The Dead Sea Scrolls are another source. I looked into the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were kind of a nothing burger when it came to Jesus because they just say the same thing that the Old Testament does pretty much, that a Savior was coming, a Christ was coming, just kind of the same stuff that the Old Testament was saying.
Right.
The more interesting thing was the group behind it.
In the winter of 1946, 3 Bedouin tribesmen were shepherding their flocks on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea in the land of Israel, when one of them threw a rock into a cave in the bluffs that overlooked the sea. He was surprised to hear the cracking of pottery and decided to come back several days later to investigate what was in the cave. Crawling into the cave, he discovered about a dozen earthen jars. Most were empty, but out of the last one, he pulled 3 leather rolls. The largest of these rolls turned out to be what we call the Great Isaiah Scroll. It was a complete copy of the book of Isaiah in Hebrew, written out around 125 BC. That is about 1,000 years earlier than any complete copy of a biblical book that we had available prior to that time. That was the beginning of the discovery of what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls, which many have called the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. People naturally want to know, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, they're fragments of about 1,000 religious manuscripts, that is, handwritten copies of religious books, found at one site called Qumran on the northwest shore of the Dead Sea. Out of these 1,000 or so scrolls, about a quarter were copies of biblical books. Those are very interesting because they are the oldest handwritten copies of biblical books that we have available for scholarship. The other 3/4 of that 1,000 scrolls were various religious writings from the community that lived at this site called Qumran. It turns out that they were what we would think of as a Jewish monastery. They were a group of celibate men. They were called the Essenes, and they lived in male community on the shores of the Dead Sea, dedicating themselves to the study of Scripture, to prayer, and to awaiting the coming of the Messiah. Many of their religious activities would be strikingly familiar to us as Catholics. They practiced water washing for the forgiveness of sins, a daily meal, a sacred meal consisting of bread and wine, and they were ruled over by a supervisor, so to speak, a bishop, and under him 2 ranks of clergy, known as priests, and then the lowest rank of clergy known as Levites. They're absolutely fascinating religious community, and their history and their religious writings shed a lot of light on the New Testament and on the early history of the church, and the full implications of their community and their writings are only beginning to be realized among scholars, even though the scrolls have been known for about 50 years.
There were a people called the Essenes, and they established a community on the shore of the Dead Sea at Qumran. And they were this ancient Jewish, kind of did their own thing. They thought it was their duty to collect holy religious texts and important documents and save them for the future.
That sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah. And they started writing 100 BC, so about 200 years before Jesus' death. And they continued writing these Dead Sea Scrolls up until about 66 AD. soon before they disappeared from the face of history, these Dead Sea Scrolls were placed in these pots and put in this cave in Jordan, and they survive to this day, and they're kind of the earliest accounts of pieces of the Old Testament. But there was also just writings that they thought would be important, kind of like descriptions of their culture and daily lives. They're trying to make kind of like a storage vault of stuff. But I guess today we're talking about Jesus. Do these scrolls, I guess, solidify Jesus? Even though these people were active during the life of Jesus, they didn't really write about him all that much. They just, like I said before, they just do the same stuff that the Old Testament mentioned. They mention a son of God and a son of the Most High that is going to come to save the world and stuff like that. But no real eyewitness accounts from the Dead Sea Scrolls. So no real proof of Jesus from the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Just a bunch of nebulous whatever stuff.
They were they were determined to just do their own thing. Kind of a cool group of people, but yeah, not really somebody who met Jesus directly. They just happened to be active at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And we're just collecting a bunch of bullshit like me with my library at home.
Yeah. When did Notre Dame set on fire?
That was recent, like last year?
Yeah, I think so. I actually don't have the exact date, but that's related to our next thing, because part of the headlines that came after Notre Dame was put out, and like all those billionaires did their like vanity funding to like rebuild the roof and all that. Another headline that kept on popping up is, are Jesus's crown of thorns okay? Because Notre Dame purports to have a crown of thorns that was worn by Jesus as he was being crucified. That's what they claim.
April 2019.
April 2019. Christ. Yeah. That seems like a lifetime ago.
Yes.
Yeah. It's a kind of a tall claim to say that they got these from the head of Jesus, that they can trace it all the way back. Because the earliest writings that mention this crown of thorns, and it's kind of just like this weaving of thorns in a circle that's being kept in this glass circular tube. It almost looks like a halo, funny enough, except with thorns on the inside. And it's been preserved all this time. But the earliest it ever said that it emerged was in 530 AD. Again, Jesus died in 33 AD. So this is almost 500 years after his death, before these thorns are even seen. Just for perspective, that's more than 3 times older than the entire history of Canada, the country of Canada. So if you go back to the start of Canada, before Canada existed, you could go back 2 more times, and you still wouldn't have the amount of time that passed between Jesus dying and any records of these thorns. So dubious kind of linkage of ownership.
Very tenuous.
Like, and especially with all the fakes that were going around. Like I said, like counterfeiters were making fakes all the time. Like, how hard would it have been for somebody to like make a nice crown of thorns, and then just all they have to do is convince like a high church member that it's the real deal? And you know, up until this day, these thorns have gone from church to church and like this holy tour, and people make pilgrimages to see these thorns. But the first you hear about them is 500 years after Jesus' death. So are they the thorns that were on his head? Dubious.
Yeah.
In many ways, the rescuers did God's work, rushing to save the irreplaceable relics ensconced at Notre Dame, some 2,000 years old. Rector Patrick Chauvet says they had to break open a chest in the treasury to get the objects. Paris's mayor describing a human chain of first responders passing the tunic of Saint Louis, a nail and piece of wood said to be from Christ's cross, as well as the crown of thorns. Relics among the rescued artifacts transferred today to the Louvre for restoration. Amazingly, the 8,000-pipe organ appears to be spared as well. Johann Vexo played at the cathedral.
And like, there's no real other direct evidence of Jesus, like as far as like existing relics that we possess. Like I said before, there were so many frauds going around Europe. There were so many people that were willing to make fakes and sell them to churches, because churches had a lot of money back then, that any claim of it being authentic is dubious, especially since, like, if you take into account how many pieces of wood are out there and how many like chunks of Jesus's body. There's a whole bunch of churches that have like a finger or a hand or a foot of Jesus. If you take into account how many of them exist, you could make hundreds of crosses, enough nails to staple Jesus to the cross like time and time again, and enough Jesuses to make several bodies of Jesus.
It definitely doesn't seem that plausible.
Yeah. There are some actually strange archaeological evidences that a Jesus existed. Now, when I say a Jesus, I don't mean like Son of God, can bring people back from the dead, change water into wine. I mean like a historical account of somebody that was named Jesus, or was named something like Jesus, or had a character that was like Jesus in the Bible. That being a preacher from the Jewish faith who got in trouble with the Romans and eventually got crucified. One piece of evidence that may point to Jesus being an actual figure is him going from town to town preaching good news. When he would spread his gospel, he would go from small town to small town. This is accounted in the Bible. And they would say that he would preach at street corners and stuff like that. When he got to a town called Migdal, or Magdala in Aramaic, when he got to that city, it says in the Bible that he preached at a synagogue. Now, people in that time didn't have much money. They were really living like meager living. It was still like, even like pre-feudalism, people did not have extra money, and entire towns didn't have extra money for vanity projects. People were living hand to mouth back then. So this was a tiny town. They didn't have money to construct a synagogue. So for years, people thought that was a false claim in the Bible, that he didn't preach at this synagogue because one didn't exist in this tiny town that couldn't have afforded one. But in September 2009, there was a group of archaeologists that dug up what they think is a synagogue in this tiny town.
Cool.
And it didn't have like architecture that was similar to like a home at the time or like a business at the time. It had markings of being an actual synagogue, like having a block in the middle that had a seven-branched menorah and a chariot of fire and a horde of symbols associated with the precincts of the Jerusalem temple. So it's sort of something like in the Bible, it says that he preached at a synagogue in this town. And for years, they couldn't find a synagogue, and then archaeologists found a synagogue in that town. None of these apart like prove Jesus. It's just like interesting that something in archaeological evidence proves something that happened in the Bible. There's evidence supporting how Jesus was died and buried. There used to be a misconception that Jesus, like part of the Jesus story, like how he was taken down on the cross and given a proper Jewish burial, that was fake. That was the main like theory or conception, because most people thought the Romans, when they crucified somebody, when they nailed somebody to a cross and executed them, they would just let their bodies rot on the cross, and they would let the birds peck at their carcass and stuff like that. And they didn't think they would let somebody have proper funerals. But then in 1968, there was a skeletal heel that was found in a ossuary or a bone box inside a tomb near Jerusalem. So that means that somebody was nailed to a cross and afterwards was allowed to have a proper Jewish burial. So again, something that we thought was, oh, this isn't right because it isn't how things were done. We found evidence that apparently sometimes Romans allowed proper Jewish funerals and burials for people that they crucified.
Cool.
Now, this is where it gets kind of reaching. Again, I'm trying to give every benefit of the doubt to Jesus. I'm trying to give him a good chance. I'm trying to Iron Man the Jesus argument to see where we get. This may be a reach, but they thought that fishing vessels were made a certain size back in ancient Galilee. And Jesus described a ship that had 12 seats and room for one captain, one person at the front. And archaeologists didn't know of any ships that matched that description until they dug up a boat in 1986 that had that exact number. Seats for 12 people and an oarsman at the front. Now,
Cool.
just because in the Bible it said that there's a boat that sits 13 and they dig up a boat that seats 13, I'm not saying that that's the boat that Jesus drove. Just that apparently they built boats like that along the Sea of Galilee. And it was something that like Jesus and his party could have used. There's the pagan temple and in Bethsaida. In Matthew 11:21 it says, "Woe unto thee, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre or Sidon, gentle cities on the Phoenician coast that Jesus perhaps invoked for saving purposes, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes." Now that's a bunch of fancy words that are basically saying that Jesus was super mad at this city, Bethsaida, because despite him performing some of his greatest miracles there, according to the Gospels, he healed a blind man in that city. He fed thousands. That's the miracle in the Bible where he replicated bread and replicated fish. And apparently, according to the Bible, after he performed these big miracles, he was super mad at Bethsaida because despite them seeing his holy Jesus power, they were still choosing to be heathens. That's him kind of like putting the curse on Bethsaida because they did not repent after seeing his works.
How dare they?
Yeah. But something else that popped up in the archaeological record that sort of supports it is archaeologists discovered evidence of a pagan temple in Bethsaida. Now, in this time, these weren't common. These type of temples, they were kind of like going out of style, especially in ancient Palestine. These types of temples weren't really common, especially again for small towns. They couldn't afford like some obscure temple unless they really believed in it. But they dug up a pagan temple, a pagan temple that, according to religious Jewish historians, would have angered Jews at the time. People who were following Judaism at the time would have been offended by this type of pagan temple. They would have seen it as heathenry, and they would have seen it as like putting something before God. So it would have been exactly the kind of thing that would piss Jesus off if he existed and practices the Judaism of the time. My water hasn't turned into wine yet. Now, that's about it for the archaeological evidence that points out Jesus may have existed in the Bible. Those are the archaeological pins. So again, kind of scant evidence. A lot of it is kind of reaching, but there is some points that agree with the Bible in some ways, showing that like in some places in the Bible it wasn't bullshitting. Now, the problem is Jesus really didn't become super notorious until after his death, and Christianity was on the rise, and people like learned who he was and stuff like that, according to the Bible. So while he was living, he didn't really make a mark. Like most historians say, like, hey, even if this Jesus guy existed, in that time, it's very hard for somebody that wasn't notable when they were alive to make a mark. He wasn't really an important guy, so his name didn't get on many documents. His face wouldn't have been on any coins. Like records wouldn't have been written about him. So that's why even if he existed, like his notoriety rising after his death, in the time, like historians trying to record it and stuff like that, he's not really notorious enough to leave enough of a mark. So most historians say that like even if he existed, you wouldn't expect to find like a lot of evidence. So it's not like the absence of evidence is proof Jesus didn't exist. It's just like in that age, it was you had to make a mark in order to be remembered in history. Yeah. So that's the archaeological, that's the physical evidence. Let's look at the Bible as quote unquote evidence.
Yes.
Let's talk about the Bible's accuracy as a historical document. It's improper to say that the Bible can't be used to interpret history, and it's improper to say that the Bible can alone be used to interpret history. It's a very metaphorical book, full of tales, full of exaggerations, full of fantastical like storytelling elements. It's obvious the authors wanted to sensationalize and exaggerate and like make things bigger and grander and more dramatic to make their point. Like you can read that when you read through the Bible. Everything is very, very kind of extra in ways, you know?
Super extra.
Yeah. But there are like it still has its use as a historical document because it is written by people of that age and it shows kind of reflections into the little lives. Even if they're writing fantastical stories that may not be true, it kind of gives them an insight into little pieces of their lives and stuff like that. Yeah. And it's important to remember that the Bible is not only a book, but it's a collection of letters and texts and journals and sources all put together in a compilation. So not only can you not like make an overall statement about the Bible, you really have to like go into each book and the source where each book came from to determine how much you can depend upon it within history. Again, that's a whole field of study.
So it's kind of like a Q drop, then, is what you're telling me, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, you can pick out little grains of truth from it. Yeah.
It's you gotta bake the Bible or whatever and get all the information you need out of it to see what society was like then and the lives of these people.
Yeah. It sort of is like when you follow QAnoners online, like you get little glimpses into their lives. Like even though they're talking horse shit, you see like, oh, he is eating like Doritos on bread. And you learn about a little bit of that person's history, even though they're shit posting. I can roll with that. Still not wine. Let's go to evidence in the New Testament. Again, the Old Testament can't really be used to show that Jesus really existed, because it was written before him, and the most that Jesus is mentioned is as a possible future character. Like somebody, and like whether Jesus was the Son of God, I don't think he was. Whether Jesus was the Son of God or like he took upon that role when he learned about it in Judaism is up in the air. But I think it's much more likely the second one.
So humanity finally got enough XP to unlock the Jesus character.
I think so. Yeah, humanity had been grinding for centuries, building wheels and riding camels, and they unlocked enough XP to get a Jesus. Yeah.
Nerds.
Yeah.
When were the New Testament books, specifically the Gospels, written?
Well, 3 of them were written by the fall of Jerusalem or fairly close to the fall of Jerusalem. Most conservative scholars will put the Gospels, the 3 synoptic Gospels, will have been written by AD 70. A few will put them some years after, but not much later than 80, certainly. And then the Gospel of John is usually put in the 90s. That's important because we're within the lifetime of some of the people who experienced the events being discussed. So your ability to play fast and loose with the facts is not there.
What about the other documents that aren't in the New Testament that the Jesus Seminar is citing that should be either the 5th Gospel or have as much weight as the 4 Gospels?
Well, I think the important one in that mix is the Gospel of Thomas. And it is really a 2nd century document that they have moved up in the food chain, if you will, of the sources, to the 2nd spot next to Mark. And in doing so, they're trying to reduce Jesus to a teacher of Proverbs, a sage, if you will, who basically said several nice things about God, and that was just about it.
Oh, yeah, so the New Testament evidence. So the most detailed record of the life and death of Jesus comes from the 4 Gospels and other New Testament writings. Again, these are all Christian and obviously and understandably biased in what they report. They have to be evaluated very critically to establish any historical and reliable information. These people have a motivation to talk up Jesus since they were, quote unquote, claiming to be his disciples. So that they're biased in that way.
Yeah, they don't want to look like a bunch of dicks.
Yeah. But yeah, the central claims of the Testaments match claims made by like historians in history. So like I said, seems to exist when you look at the perspective of other like professional historians that wrote things down. I'm going to mention them later, but people like Flavius Josephus, Tacitus, not Tacitus, Tacitus. That's the one. Pliny the Younger, and mentions in the Talmud, which is a Jewish text.
Talmud.
Talmud. Yeah, thank you. Those all have historical accounts of Jesus or a Christ-like figure. So the skeleton of his story seems to exist as it does in the Gospels. Does that mean all the stuff around it is true? I'm not so sure about that. But there are central claims about him that he was a Jew with followers. He was executed on the orders of a Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, are borne out in historical data when you look at historians that wrote about it. But how dependable are each of the Gospels just by themselves? Grains of truth in each have historical evidence, but there are many falsehoods and myths and claims that just disagree with the historical record overall. Most modern scholars hold that the Gospels were written between 70 AD and 110 AD. So at minimum, you're 35 years out from Jesus' death, at minimum. None of the four Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. The very first Gospel, the Gospel of Mark, was written 40 years after the death of Jesus, around the year 70 AD. Mark is skimpy when it comes to like the books of the Bible. It isn't really substantial. It's very skeletal. Like it just tells the basic story. It doesn't have the birth legends, the genealogies, all of Jesus' childhood adventures, all his like little side quests. It really just tells the basic story. It tells it begins the story with John the Baptist giving Jesus a bath and ending with women running from the empty tomb with Jesus. Many scholars point out that the Gospel of Mark shows signs of a lack of knowledge of geographical, political, and religious matters in Judea in the time of Jesus. Basically, there's lots of signs that whoever Mark was that wrote the Gospel of Mark, he wasn't a local, and things that locals would know. Like, for example, there was a passage in Mark where Jesus cast demons out of two men into a group of pigs. And Jesus was in this certain town when it happened. And it describes that the pigs just ran down the hill close to this town into a sea. It was just a quick trip down a steep hill, and the pigs were already at the sea. Problem was, when you look at where the city is, it's 31 miles away from any body of water.
That sounds like bullshit.
Yeah. And the Bible doesn't say like the pigs disappeared into the middle distance and we don't know what became of them. It says that they watched the pigs go into the water. And I don't care if you're the Son of Christ, you can't see 31 miles. Another sign that Mark wasn't a local, or he didn't really know the local culture, is in Mark 10:12. He says that Jesus says that if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she has committed adultery. The problem was that it would be meaningless in ancient Palestine because in that time, only men could obtain divorce. So having some passage about the consequences of a woman divorcing her husband wouldn't make any sense. The women at that time wouldn't be able to anyway. Mm-hmm. Like, that's kind of where Mark sits. It has a bunch of these signs that it wasn't written by a local. It was written 40 years after the death of Jesus, and it's very scant on details. Matthew and Luke, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, began with Mark and edited and adapted with different issues as they arose in their communities. So it's thought that whoever wrote Matthew and Luke, and most historians agree that whoever wrote Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John weren't dudes named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Matthew and Luke basically copied off of Mark, and they added things that were relevant in their own communities to the text to make it relevant to them. That's what most historians agree upon. The amount of plagiarism from Matthew and Luke is insane. Only 3% of the Gospel of Mark has not been plagiarized into Matthew and Luke, like verbatim, word for word.
That's wild.
Yeah. And even past that, Luke and Matthew both share a bunch of shit with each other. And there's also a weird source named Q. Funny enough, it's called
Ooh, dun dun dun.
it's actually by biblical scholars. It's called the Q source. Yeah, I'm sure anybody that's a QAnon follower that is going to get a kick out of that. But basically, they don't know where the source is. They can't track down an original copy. The only reason they know it existed is because there's big parts of Luke and Matthew, 30% of Luke and 20% of Matthew, that copied directly from this Q source. So they basically were both caught plagiarizing from the same paper, but they can't find that original paper.
Crazy. Can't imagine why.
Yeah. Yeah. So we don't have 4 independent sources for the ministry of Jesus. We have a Mark, who never met Jesus, never lived in Palestine, didn't seem to be familiar with the culture, writing a gospel 40 years after the fact. And then you had 2 guys that plagiarized all but 3% of his work, and then added their own stuff in their own communities, and also plagiarized from some other mysterious source that we can't find.
The Gospel of John is different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Gospel of John does not contain most of the stories found in the Synoptic Gospels. For example, in John, there's no account of Jesus actually being baptized. There's no account of his birth either. There's no account of him going into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. Jesus never tells a parable in the Gospel of John. Jesus never casts out a demon in the Gospel of John. Jesus does not go up to the Mount of Transfiguration in the Gospel of John. Jesus does not have his Last Supper in which he gives out the bread and the wine and says, "This is my body, this is my blood," in the Gospel of John. Jesus is not put on trial before the Jewish Sanhedrin in the Gospel of John. Wide-ranging differences where John doesn't have the same stories as the Synoptics. John has a different set of stories. It has a different set of miracles, including the first miracle in the Gospel of John, where Jesus turns the water into wine. Always the favorite of my students at Chapel Hill when it comes to the miracle stories, turning of water into wine. John has many dialogues between Jesus and someone else that are found only in John. For example, Jesus' discussion with Nicodemus in chapter 3, or with the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. Many of Jesus' sayings found in John, only in John.
So the Gospel of John, as I said, it's really unique. Unlike the other one where Mark was like very bare bones and just the basics, and then a bunch of it was plagiarized, and then some Q sources plagiarized, and like those 3 Gospels are super incestuous with each other. John is its own unique thing. It has the same concept, same philosophy, kind of tells the same story, but it doesn't necessarily copy from those texts. It's almost like a kind of a cover song, almost.
Cool.
Yeah, and like there are some people that say that John like plagiarized as well because he shares a similar structure to the other Gospels, but there's also like a group of thought that says that maybe because the other Gospels were becoming big things, were becoming prominent within like Christian circles and early Christian circles, that they were kind of just like setting the format for how Gospels should be done. And then when John wrote his, like, 10 to 30 years after those were written, he kind of just followed that format.
That makes sense.
Yeah. Now, the Gospel of John, super interesting when it comes to like how unique it is with the Gospels. Does it say anything about Jesus that can be proven historically? No, not really. It doesn't make any new claims that can be proven through historical or archaeological evidence the other Gospels didn't make. So the Gospel of John really didn't help to prove Jesus anymore. The big proofs of Jesus, I'll save these right for the end, is the historical mentions. So there was these historians, these people who wrote down history. That was their whole thing. And they served as witnesses and scribes for politicians, and they thought it was their duty to document history and preserve it for future generations, or document history and send it back somewhere so that a different part of the world could be like informed about the happenings. And one of these people, Flavius Josephus, mentioned Jesus in the Bible. He was a first-century Jewish historian who is one of the best sources of information about early Palestine and Jesus. He wrote a massive 20-volume history of the Jewish people, and he published it around 93 AD. And in it, he writes about Jesus. He writes that Josephus identifies the victim James as the brother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. Jesus in the Bible was known as the Messiah. So it seems that he mentioned Jesus there.
Cool.
Yeah, and he also mentions Jesus in a text called the Testonium Flavitinum, and he describes that a man who did surprising deeds and was to be condemned by Pontius Pilate.
All stacks up.
Yeah, Tacitus, another account of Jesus, appeared in his book, The Annals of Imperial Rome, a first-century history of the Roman Empire written around 116 AD. Now, the first historian was a Jewish historian, so he would have some interest in preserving, a Christ figure, especially when he wrote it in 93 AD, when these Gospels were becoming popular, when Christianity was on the rise. Flavius Josephus might have had some motivation to falsify some texts, stretch some truths. Tacitus, not so much. He was a Roman historian who really wouldn't mention things about Jewish historians and about Jewish happenings unless he thought they were significant, unless he thought the Roman emperor should know about them. And he mentions Jesus. He mentions that Emperor Nero falsely blamed the persons commonly called Christians, who were hated for their enormities and for their founder Christus, who was put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius.
Ooh.
Yeah, so this historian, in his Annals of Imperial Rome, mentions a Christus figure that was put to death by Pontius Pilate, and it kind of tells the same story as in the Bible. Yeah, and as you read through Tacitus's account, you see that he tells kind of the basic structure of the story of Jesus, except from a totally separate account from a Roman perspective. He told of this Christ figure who had a bunch of followers that sprang up after he died and kind of passed on his word. Pliny the Younger. Pliny the Younger was a Roman governor and a historian, and he wrote down that Christians would sing hymns to a Christ as a god. Pliny the Younger, so he documented that early Christians, so the ones that the original apostles, were theorized to have, first radicalized into the movement, kind of the first big group of Christians. Pliny the Younger documented them singing songs and singing gospels and singing hymns to this Christ figure.
Well, that's neat.
Yeah. There's Suetonius, who some scholars believe that Roman historian Suetonius references Jesus when he makes a mention of a Jewish figure that was causing disturbances, and when investigated, he was Christus. So again, you have a Roman historian that talks about Jesus being a little troublemaker in ancient Palestine.
Yeah, just being like a big thorn in everyone's side.
So the Talmud, there are several passages in the Talmud which are believed to be references to Jesus. The name used in the Talmud is Yeshu. Yeshu practiced black magic and deceived and led Israel astray. Now, Jesus isn't named here, but from the perspective of some, like, what you would consider Jewish conservatives, so kind of people that believed in the old ways of the church and the old ways of the faith, they would have seen this Yeshu figure as a practicer of black magic. especially when they talk about his feats. Like when you look at what Jesus was doing, like making water into wine, you know, replicating fishes, bringing people back from the dead, healing the blind, curing sickness, stuff like that, it would seem like black magic to them. And they talk about
It seemed like black magic now.
yeah. Now, where this falls apart is when you read about the rest of what this Yeshu figure was, because the rest of his storyline doesn't really follow. Some historians still believe this is a reference to Jesus, and they just got the rest of his life wrong or something like that. But they have this Yeshu figure traveling to Egypt and traveling all over kind of the Middle East in ancient times, and far and away, way further than Jesus ever made it. So that's where that kind of falls apart. Some people believe that the Talmud is referencing Jesus, but when you look at the rest of the story of this Yeshu figure, it kind of falls apart. Now, what do we make of all this? Like, I talked about a bunch of historians that talked about Jesus. I talked about some archaeological evidence. I talked about some scant physical evidence, evidence from the Gospels. After many, many years of research, there is this one basic conception that a lot of historians agree on. Not all of them, because this is still a deeply contested issue. But there was 8 indisputable facts that were put forward that have been proven either in writings from historians or in the archaeological record. And these are included when they have multiple sources or a really solid primary source that records them. So this is basically the conclusion I came to after reading all these, and I kind of came to agree with these 8 indisputable facts put forward by historians. So these are basically the things about Jesus that are true, and the rest is kind of up in the air. Jesus was probably actually a Galilean preacher. So in the Bible, he went around the Sea of Galilee and visited towns and preached. It seems like, yes, somebody like Jesus was indeed doing that. So was indeed preaching at the time. His activities were confined to Galilee and Judea. Yeah, he didn't appear to go anywhere else, and there's no real historical record of him going anywhere else. There's multiple accounts of him being baptized by John the Baptist. It seems like a Christ figure or a Jesus or somebody who was calling themselves Jesus or some Jewish troublemaker in ancient Palestine was baptized by John the Baptist. He apparently had disciples. There was accounts of him being followed around by these disciples. He flipped tables and kind of like did his whole like, you shall not perform like the exchanging of goods and gold in the holy temple kind of thing, and flip tables. It seems like there's multiple accounts of that actually happening. He was crucified by Pontius Pilate. After his death, his disciples continued to propagate his word, and some of his disciples were persecuted for that. Those are the things that have been proven. Everything else, including all the other details in the Gospels, have not been sought out in any historical record. Does Jesus exist? I think there was a Jesus. There was a historical Jesus at some point. Now, I think that history and the motivations of Christians have really colored who he became in the modern age. But I do think there was a historical Jesus that preached in Galilee and was sort of a troublemaker and got together some disciples and even played the part of a rebel to some degree, and then was executed by Pontius Pilate.
By that, definitely by that, Jesus was like a dude. Obviously, I don't think that he was the Son of God. But I definitely believe that there was a dude going around just being a big thorn in all these people's sides, like the first rebels. Super cool.
Yeah, I think that, certainly there's enough there, I think, to suggest that he does, in fact, exist. A lot of the lore around it, though, I would certainly say that, any sort of scrutiny around it would show that that's not the case.
Yeah, especially when, like, a lot of that lore that surrounds it seems to be from people who wrote many years after he died and didn't seem to be locals or really members of the culture at all. It's like somebody from I don't know, it's like somebody from America writing like a Canadian romance novel and getting a bunch of shit wrong. You know, would you trust them with the rest of the details?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm not allowed to comment on any of this. It's all classified. Sorry, guys.
You know too much.
I can neither confirm nor deny that.
Fair.
If you were to tell us, would you stop being an employee in hell and become a client?
I mean, that's classified.
Fair enough.
Don't push them. Don't push them.
Look,
get in
my
trouble.
quarterly review's coming up right away here. I gotta go talk to the big pit boss. Like, it's gonna be a bad time if I tell you anything about the big guy.
Yeah. Alrighty. So that's my word, and I'm sticking to it. Jesus was a real guy, but he didn't perform magic tricks. We're releasing this on Christmas. You know what? Merry Christmas. You know,
Happy holidays. Happy whatever.
holidays.
Festivus.
Yeah, make it what you want. Don't worship capitalism or any shit like that. Just make Christmas or the holidays or whatever you celebrate like something you want to enjoy.
And wear a mask.
Wear a mask. Be safe.
Yeah, even if you don't believe it, just wear a mask just in case you're wrong. Just in case you're wrong. What could be lost, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So from Occultae Veritatis, I'm Mood Gallifrey.
Murray.
Richard Bigley.
And infecting our equipment forever time.
The soundboard demon, and I'm actually only here for a short amount of time, 2 eternities.
Good to know. That's more than our lifetime, so we'll be good. Okay, have a good night.
Right. Love you. Bye.
Alrighty, that's our Christmas special. I'm going to keep on doing specials on December 25th of people who were born on January 25th or events that happened on January 25th. You know, until I run out of ideas. Hope you enjoyed this year's version of that. Playing us out this episode is from the band The Arrogant Worms, Jesus' Brother Bob. If you haven't experienced the Arrogant Worms quite yet, just type that into your Google search bar, find the most convenient place to find their music, sit down and enjoy every one of their songs. They're brilliant, and they gave us permission to use this song, and we love them. See you in the after show.
If you haven't heard of me, I wouldn't be surprised. I bet you know my relatives. Their names will never die. My mother is a saint, and my brother is a god. But all I am is Jesus' brother Bob. Jesus' brother Bob. Jesus' brother Bob. A nobody relative of the Son of God. If only I'd been born just a little sooner, I'd be more than the brother of God Jr. I have to pay the ferry to cross the Galilee. But not my brother, no, not him. He walks across for free. I finally get to work about 9:15. Already he's turning water into wine. Jesus' brother Bob, Jesus' brother Bob, a nobody relative of the Son of God. If only I'd been born just a little sooner, I'd be more than the brother of God Jr. One day when I was home, I heard a mighty roar. There were 1,000 people right outside the door.
Help us, Jesus, help us!
Came the cheering from the mob. Then they got a look at me.
Oh, not it's only Bob.
Jesus' brother Bob, Jesus' brother Bob, a nobody relative of the Son of God. If only I'd been born just a little sooner, I'd be more than the brother of God Jr. He died upon the cross. I thought that I was free. Finally, people would get to know me for me.
Hi, Bob.
Hi. This was my big chance to finally get ahead. The next thing you know, he's rising from the dead. Jesus' brother Bob, Jesus' brother Bob, a nobody relative of the Son of God. If only I'd been born
just a little sooner, I'd be more than the brother of God Jr. Everyone! Jesus, Brother Bob, Jesus, Brother Bob, a nobody relative of the Son of God. If only I'd been born just a little sooner, I'd be more than the brother of God Jr.
Alrighty. So, how was your year? Bit stressful, huh? So let's take this time in this after show just to have some holiday cheer. Cue the crackling fire. Cue the cliche Christmas jazz. Let's read through some holidays that you may or may not celebrate, but make some people somewhere happy. Have a beautiful Bodhi Day. Have a killer Krampusnacht. Have a stellar Saturnalia. Have a headstrong Hanukkah. Have a YOLO Yule. Have a youthful Yolda. Have a Titanic Soul Invictus. Have a ferocious Festivus. Have a kick-ass Kwanzaa. Have a filling Feast of Winter. And above all, happy holidays. Stay warm, replenish, rest, and prepare for the next round of controversy that 2021 will bring. Have a lovely winter night.